They called her the heavy burden of Willow Creek, too big for a corset, too plain for a husband, and destined to die a spinster in her father's bakery. Hattie May had given up on love until a desperate letter arrived from the Devil's Peak. Elias Blackwood, a mountain man rumored to have a temper so foul he'd killed a bear with his bare hands and scared off 3 wives before breakfast. Everyone told Hattie she was walking into a death sentence. They said he was a demon. But when the snow trapped them alone in his cabin, Hattie discovered that the demon of the mountain was hiding a secret far more dangerous than his anger. And the twist, he wasn't the one she needed to be afraid of. The year was 1884, and the heat in Willow Creek, Wyoming was enough to blister paint. But it was nothing compared to the shame that burned Hattie May Sutcliffe's cheeks every time she walked down Main Street. Hattie was not a small woman. In a world where ladies were expected to be as fragile as porcelain teacups, Hattie was an iron skillet. At 24 years old, she carried 300 pounds on a 5'4" frame. Her father, Tobias Sutcliffe, the town's wealthiest baker, made sure she felt every ounce of it. "Move, girl. You're blocking the display window," Tobias barked, shoving past her with a tray of fresh sourdough. "Lord knows you don't need to be staring at the cakes. You've frightened off the widow Higgins just by looming there." Hattie stepped back, her boots scuffing the floorboards. "I was just sweeping, Pa." "Sweep in the back," he sneered. "Out of sight. Nobody buys a wedding cake from a woman who looks like she ate the whole wedding party." Hattie kept her head down, a habit she had perfected over a decade. She retreated to the storeroom, the smell of yeast and sugar turning her stomach. She knew what the town whispered. They called her Big Hattie. They made bets on how many horses it would take to pull her carriage if she ever got married. A cruel joke, considering no man in Willow Creek would look at her twice unless it was to mock her. But Hattie had a secret. Hidden beneath the loose floorboard under her cot in the attic was a cigar box filled with letters. Not letters from a lover, but letters from a broker in Cheyenne. A marriage broker. 3 weeks ago, in a fit of despair after hearing her younger, thinner sister Prudence mock her size to a suitor Hattie had written to the broker. She had sent a daguerreotype, a rare, expensive photograph she'd paid for, with stolen egg money that showed her face clearly, but was cropped strategically at the shoulders. She hadn't lied about her weight in the letter, but she hadn't been explicit either. She simply wrote, "I am a woman of significant substance and strength, capable of hard work, and not afraid of isolation." Yesterday the reply had come. "Miss Sutcliffe, I have a match. His name is Elias Blackwood. He holds a claim on 600 acres up near the timberline of the Bighorn Mountains. He is particular. He requires a wife immediately to satisfy a land grant stipulation. He does not care for society. He asks only for a woman who can survive the winter. He has accepted your offer. You are to take the stage to Fort Collins, then a mule train to the base of the pass. He will meet you there on the 14th. Hattie reread the letter by the light of a tallow candle. Elias Blackwood. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. They called him the Bear of Bighorn. Rumors swirled like dust devils around him. They said he was 7 feet tall. They said he had a face scarred by fire and a temper that came from the devil himself. The story went that he had thrown a man off a cliff just for trespassing on his creek. "He'll kill you," she whispered to herself, or a treacherous voice in her head whispered back, "He'll look at you. See the fat girl everyone else sees, and send you back down the mountain in shame." The next morning, the decision was made for her. Prudence announced her engagement to the son of the town mayor, a slimy man named Caleb Thorne. During the celebratory breakfast, Tobias looked at Hattie and laughed. "Well, at least we won't have to worry about buying Hattie a dress. We can just drape a tablecloth over her and sit her in the corner." The table erupted in laughter. Hattie stood up. The chair screeched against the floor. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling but loud. "Leaving for the pantry," Prudence giggled. "Leaving this house. I'm getting married." Silence descended like a guillotine. Then Tobias snorted. "To who the Barnum and Bailey circus? To Elias Blackwood," Hattie declared. "I leave on the noon stage." The colour drained from her father's face, not out of concern, but out of shock. "Blackwood, the savage up on the ridge. He'll skin you alive, girl." "Better to be skinned by a savage than pecked to death by chickens," Hattie said. She turned and walked up the stairs, the heavy thud of her steps for once sounding like a war drum rather than a burden. She packed her one good dress, a dark blue wool that was tight in the arms, and her mother's Bible. She sewed her savings into the hem of her petticoat. As she boarded the stagecoach, ignoring the driver's groan as the springs compressed under her weight, she didn't look back at the bakery. She was going to meet a monster, but she was leaving hell behind. The journey took 4 days. The stagecoach ride was humiliating. 2 other passengers, a banker and his pinch-faced wife, openly complained about the lack of room caused by Hattie's hips. Hattie stared out the window, watching the plains give way to the jagged purple teeth of the mountains. At the final outpost, a muddy trading post called Dead Mule Hattie waited. It was the 14th. The air was thin and bit at her lungs. She sat on her trunk, clutching her reticule, watching the trail that led up into the dense pines. Hours passed. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow-dusted ground. "He ain't comin', lady," the station master spat, chewing on a piece of straw. "Blackwood don't come down for nothing. Last time he was here, he broke a man's jaw for looking at his horse wrong." Hattie's heart hammered against her ribs. Had he seen her from the trees? Had he seen her sighs and turned back in disgust? Just as the panic began to constrict her throat, the ground vibrated. A horse emerged from the tree line, a massive black Clydesdale, the kind of beast used for pulling plows, not riding, and on its back sat a mountain. Elias Blackwood was everything the rumors promised, and worse. He wore a coat made of what looked like an entire bear fur and all. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but a thick, unruly beard, black as coal and streaked with grey, spilled down his chest. He carried a Winchester rifle in a scabbard and a formidable hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He rode up to the station, the horse snorting steam into the frigid air. He didn't dismount. He just sat there looking down at Hattie. Hattie stood up, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. She tried to stand tall, but next to the horse and the man she felt small for the first time in her life. "Elias Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice squeaked. The man didn't speak. He stared. His eyes, hidden in the shadow of the brim, seemed to be dissecting her. He looked at her boots. He looked at her wide hips. He looked at her chest, her round face, her double chin. The silence stretched agonizing and cruel. The station master snickered in the background. Finally, Elias spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. "You the Sutcliffe girl?" "I am," Hattie said, lifting her chin. "Hattie May." "Broker said you were sturdy," Elias said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment like one would give a mule. "I am," she repeated. "You got a lot of luggage. Just this trunk." Elias grunted. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. The earth seemed to shake when his boots hit. Up close, he was terrifying. He smelled of pine resin wood smoke and old blood. He walked toward her, and Hattie flinched, expecting a blow or a harsh word. Instead, he walked her to the trunk. He lifted it, a trunk that had taken 2 men to load onto the stagecoach with one hand. He hoisted it onto the pack mule, tethered behind his horse, and lashed it down with efficient, angry movements. "Mount up her," he ordered, gesturing to the Clydesdale. Hattie stared at the horse. The stirrup was level with her chest. Mr. Blackwood, why? I cannot mount that animal unassisted, and I fear I am too heavy for— Obsidian can carry an elk carcass. He can carry you, Elias snapped. The legendary temper flared in his eyes that Hattie now saw were a startling, piercing blue. We're burning daylight. A storm is coming over the ridge. Do you want to freeze, or do you want to ride? Hattie bit her lip. She approached the horse. She grabbed the saddle horn, but her weight and her skirts made it impossible to lift her foot high enough. She struggled, her face burning with humiliation, gasping for air. She heard a growl behind her. For God's sake! Suddenly, huge hands gripped her waist. They were hard, calloused hands, but the grip wasn't painful. With a grunt of exertion, Elias hoisted her into the air as if she were a sack of flour and deposited her into the saddle. For a second, her body pressed against his chest, hard muscle beneath the fur coat. She felt heat radiating off him. Then he pulled away as if he'd been burned. He didn't mount behind her. He grabbed the reins of the Clydesdale. I'll walk. Steep trail ahead. Horse needs to balance. You'll walk, Hattie stammered. It was a 5-mile ascent, straight up. I said I'd walk, he barked, turning his back to her. Don't talk. Sound carries. Causes avalanches. It was a lie. Hattie knew it was a lie, but he started marching, pulling the horse and her 300 pounds up the mountain without slowing down. As they climbed, the snow began to fall soft at first, then driving and hard. Hattie watched the broad back of the man, trudging ahead of her. He was angry. He was rude. He was exactly the brute everyone said he was, but he was walking through knee-deep snow so she could ride. They arrived at the cabin well after dark. It was a sturdy structure of logs and stone built into the side of a cliff face, protected from the wind. Elias tied the horses and helped her down again that efficient, impersonal hoist and shoved her towards the door. Inside the cabin was freezing. The fire was dead. Stay there, he ordered. He went to the hearth and began striking flint. Hattie stood in the center of the room, shivering. Mr. Blackwood about the sleeping arrangements. The broker said— Elias spun around. The firelight finally catching his face fully. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, white and jagged, pulling his lip into a permanent, slight sneer. There is one bed, he snarled, pointing to a large fur-covered frame in the corner. And there is the floor. You take the bed. I sleep by the fire. But we are to be married, Hattie whispered. Are we not? Elias let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Married I, on paper, to keep the mining commission off my back. But don't get any ideas, woman. You're here to cook and keep this cabin from rotting while I work the timber. I didn't ask for a wife. I asked for a warm body, to sign a deed. He stood up, towering over her, his blue eyes blazing with that famed demon temper. And look at you. He sneered, his gaze raking over her heavy coat. You're soft. You're town-fed. You won't last a month up here. Once the deed is signed and the snow melts, you're going back to Willow Creek. Hattie felt the tears prick her eyes, but the memory of her father's laughter hardened her heart. She squared her shoulders. The floorboards creaked. I am not soft, Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice steady, and I have nowhere to go back to. So you are stuck with me, and I eat a lot. So you better be a good hunter. Elias blinked. The anger in his eyes faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by something that looked like surprise. He grunted, turning back to the fire. We'll see. There's stew in the pot. Eat it. Don't wake me. That night, Hattie lay in the massive bed, listening to the wind howl outside and the rhythmic breathing of the monster, sleeping on a bear-skin rug by the fire. He was cruel. He was distant. But as she drifted off, she remembered the way he had checked the cinch on the saddle 3 times before leading the horse onto the icy ledge. He was a demon, perhaps. But demons usually didn't check safety latches. The first week on Devil's Peak was a war of attrition. The cabin was not just a home. It was a fortress of filth. Elias Blackwood lived like a bear in hibernation. Dirty tin plates were stacked in the wash basin. The floor was covered in a layer of pine needles and dried mud, and the windows were so grimed with soot that high noon looked like twilight. Hattie woke up that first morning with every joint in her body screaming. The altitude made her chest tight, and the cold seeped into her bones. Elias was already gone. The only sign he had been there was the fresh stack of wood by the hearth and the absence of the coffee pot. She could have sat on the bed and cried. She could have waited for him to come back and mock her laziness. Instead, Hattie got angry. "I am not soft," she muttered to the empty room, her breath pluming in the air. She set to work. It was agonizing. Scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees was difficult with her weight. Getting back up was harder. But she found a rhythm. She boiled water, she scraped tallow off the table, and she attacked the grime with the ferocity of a woman who had been told she was useless her entire life. By late afternoon, the cabin smelled of lye soap instead of stale grease. Hattie found a sack of flour, a tin of lard, and a jar of preserved peaches in the cellar. She didn't know how to hunt or chop trees, but she was Tobias Sutcliffe's daughter. She knew dough. When the door banged open at sunset, a gust of snow and Elias Blackwood blew in. He froze in the doorway, blinking. The lantern was lit. The table was scrubbed pale, and the smell hot, flaky biscuits and bubbling peach cobbler hit him like a physical blow. He dropped a brace of rabbits on the floor, his blue eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What did you do?" "I cleaned," Hattie said, wiping her floury hands on her apron. She stood behind the table, using it as a barricade. "And I cooked, unless you prefer eating jerky that tastes like boot leather." Elias stomped his boots, snow flying. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at her. For a moment, Hattie thought he was going to yell at her for wasting supplies. "I didn't ask for a maid," he grumbled, hanging his coat on the peg. "I asked for a signature on a deed." "The deed is signed," Hattie retorted, her heart pounding. "But I have to live here too, Mr. Blackwood, and I refuse to live in a pigsty." Elias walked to the table. He was filthy, smelling of sweat and pine pitch. He reached out a massive, scarred hand and took a biscuit. He didn't sit. He popped the whole thing into his mouth. Hattie watched him. She saw his jaw work. She saw his eyes widen slightly. He swallowed, then immediately reached for another. And another. He ate 4 biscuits in rapid succession, without looking at her. "Sit," Hattie commanded, surprising herself. "I'll dish up the stew." To her shock, the demon of the mountain pulled out a chair and sat. He ate like a starving man, scraping the plate clean. When he finished the cobbler, he leaned back the wood of the chair, groaning under his massive frame. "It's edible," he muttered, wiping his beard. "It's delicious, and you know it," Hattie said, taking his plate. Elias watched her move. He watched the way her heavy arms worked the pump at the sink. He didn't offer a compliment, but later that evening, while he was whittling a piece of cedar by the fire, he spoke without looking up. "Don't scrub the floor on your knees again." Hattie paused in her mending. "It's the only way to get the dirt out." "I said don't do it." He stood up, tossing the wood into the fire. "I'll cut the handle off a broom. Make a mop. Your knees will give out. We don't have a doctor up here." It wasn't kindness, Hattie told herself. It was practicality. He didn't want a crippled wife he had to nurse. But the next morning, when she woke up, there was a crude but sturdy mop leaning against the wall, fashioned from a branch of hickory and old rags. And on the table next to the cold coffee pot was a small, erratic pile of winter berries rare and hard to find in the snow. He hadn't said a word. But he had brought her breakfast. The truce, however, was fragile. 2 days later, a rider approached the cabin. Hattie was outside, hanging laundry on a line Elias had strung up for her. The rider was a slick-looking man in a pinstripe suit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the savage wilderness. "Mrs. Blackwood, I presume," the man sneered. He didn't tip his hat. "I'm Silas Vane, representing the Rocky Mountain Mining Consortium." Hattie clutched a wet shirt to her chest. "Mr. Blackwood isn't here." "I know. That's why I'm here." Vane looked her up and down, his lip curling in a familiar way, the way men in town used to look at her. "I see Elias likes his livestock heavy. Fits with the rest of his operation." Hattie stiffened. "State your business, Mr. Vane." "Tell your husband that the deadline is approaching. Even with a wife, he needs to show significant improvement to the land to keep the claim. A few logs and a fat wife won't convince the judge in Cheyenne. Tell him to sell to me. I'll give him fair price." "And you?" Vane laughed. "I'll give you a ticket to a fat camp in the east." "Get off this land," a voice roared. Hattie spun around. Elias had emerged from the tree line. He wasn't carrying his rifle. He was carrying a splitting maul, a heavy axe used for rending logs. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Vane's horse reared. "Now, Elias, be reasonable." Elias didn't speak. He took a step forward, swinging the maul onto his shoulder. The look in his eyes was murderous. It was the demon everyone spoke of. The veins in his neck bulged, and his scar turned a violent shade of crimson. "1," Elias counted. Vane didn't wait for 2. He spurred his horse and galloped down the trail, snow kicking up behind him. Elias stood there, chest-heaving, watching the man disappear. Hattie walked toward him, trembling. "Elias? Who was that?" He turned to her. The rage didn't vanish instantly. He looked at her with wild, dilated pupils. For a second, Hattie was terrified he would turn that anger on her. "Did he touch you?" Elias rasped. "No." "Did he insult you?" Hattie looked down. "It doesn't matter." "It matters!" Elias roared, slamming the head of the maul into a stump so hard the wood split with a sound like a gunshot. "Nobody comes on my land and insults my family. If he comes back, I'll bury him in the drift." Family. The word hung in the cold air. Elias seemed to realize what he said. He yanked the axe free and turned away. "Get inside, it's freezing." But Hattie didn't move immediately. She watched him retreat to the barn. He had a temper, yes. It was explosive and terrifying. But she realized something strange. He hadn't been angry at her. He had been angry for her. The weeks turned into a month. November brought a blizzard that buried the cabin up to the windows. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling white void and the crackle of the fire inside. Confinement did strange things to people. Hattie expected Elias to grow more irritable. Instead, he grew quieter. He spent hours staring into the fire, his leg bouncing nervously. One night the wind was screaming so loud the roof beams groaned. Elias was pacing the small room back and forth like a caged tiger. "Stop pacing, Elias," Hattie said gently from her chair. "You'll wear a hole in the floor." "The roof won't hold," he muttered, not listening to her. "The snow is too heavy. It's going to collapse. Just like—" He cut himself off. "The roof is solid log, Elias. It will hold." "You don't know that," he snapped, spinning on her. "You don't know anything about weight, about crushing." He stopped, his eyes wide. He looked at Hattie at her size, and his face went pale. I didn't mean—" He grabbed his coat and threw the door open, plunging out into the blizzard. "Elias!" Hattie screamed. "You'll die out there!" He didn't listen. He disappeared into the white. Hattie waited. 5 minutes. 10. The cold blowing in through the cracks was deadly. He wasn't coming back. She grabbed her shawl and the lantern. She couldn't leave him. She pushed the door open, the wind nearly knocking her over. "Elias!" She found him in the woodshed, huddled in the corner, shaking violently. He wasn't chopping wood. He was curled into a ball, his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth. The demon of Bighorn. The man who fought bears was having a panic attack. Hattie dropped the lantern. She knelt in the sawdust, pain be damned, and crawled to him. "Elias," she soothed, reaching out. He flinched. "Get out." "It's falling the fire. The roof." He was hallucinating. Hattie didn't know the history, but she knew pain. She knew what it was like to want to hide. She didn't try to pull him up. She did the only thing she could. She moved closer and wrapped her arms around him. She pulled his head against her heavy, soft chest. She encompassed him. Her sighs, which the world called a burden, became a shield. She was a warm, solid wall against the chaos in his mind. "I've got her, you," she whispered, stroking his matted wet hair. "The roof is holding. The fire is in the hearth, not the walls. You are safe. I am here." Elias stiffened. At first, his muscles coiled like stone. But Hattie didn't let go. She held him with all the strength of her 300 pounds. She rocked him. Slowly, the trembling stopped. Elias let out a long, ragged breath. He slumped against her, his forehead resting on her shoulder. "They didn't get it out," he whispered, his voice broken and small. "The schoolhouse. In 78. The roof. The snow was too heavy. Then the stove tipped. The fire." Hattie's heart broke. The great blizzard of 78. She had heard of a schoolhouse collapse in the valley, but no one had mentioned Elias Blackwood. "I tried to lift the beam," he choked out. "I was strong. Everyone said I was the strongest man in the territory. But I couldn't lift it. I couldn't get them out before the fire took them. My wife. My little girl. Sarah." The truth spilled out like blood from a wound. The demon temper wasn't rage, wasn't. It was self-hatred. It was the desperate, clawing guilt of a man who believed his strength had failed him when it mattered most. He pushed people away because he couldn't bear to fail anyone else. He was terrifying, so no one would get close enough to see he was broken. "You aren't God Elias," Hattie said firmly, lifting his chin, so he had to look at her. "You are just a man. A weak man," he wept. "No," Hattie said. "A man who survived, and you are freezing. We are going inside." This time, when she stood up, he helped her. And when they got back inside the warm cabin, the dynamic had shifted forever. Elias sat by the fire, shivering as the adrenaline left him. Hattie made him tea with a splash of whiskey. She sat opposite him, not in the shadows, but in the light. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He didn't see the fat girl from Willow Creek. He saw the woman who had walked into a blizzard to save him. "Why didn't you run?" he asked quietly. "When I yelled. When Vane came." "Why stay?" Hattie looked down at her hands. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for the shell you live in, Elias. They look at me and see a monster of gluttony. They look at you and see a monster of rage. Maybe we're the only two people who can see the truth." Elias stood up. He crossed the small distance between them. He hesitated, his hand hovering over her shoulder. Then gently he touched her cheek. His thumb was rough, but his touch was reverent. "You aren't a monster, Hattie," he said, his voice deep and rough with emotion. "You're the only soft thing I've felt in 10 years. The air in the cabin changed. It wasn't just warmth from the fire anymore. It was charged. Hattie held her breath, but Elias pulled back the wall, going up again, though thinner this time. "Get to sleep. Vane will be back, and when he comes, he won't come alone. We have work to do." Hattie lay in bed that night, listening to the wind. She realized two things. First, she was falling in love with her husband. And second, Silas Vane wasn't just after the land. He was coming for Elias's life, and Hattie was the only one standing in the way. The thaw came in December, a brief, deceptive window of clear skies that turned the snowpack into treacherous slush. The deadline for the land grant improvement was 3 weeks away. The morning after the blizzard revelation, the dynamic in the cabin had shifted tectonic plates. Elias no longer looked through Hattie. He looked at her with a guarded, intense curiosity. Hattie, having held the demon while he wept, no longer feared his volume. She understood its source. "I'm going down to the creek bed," Elias announced, strapping on his revolver. "Need to start moving stones for a retaining wall. If the inspector sees we're building a sluice for a timber mill, it secures the claim." Hattie was already tying her apron strings, cinching them tight over her heavy wool dress. "I'm coming with you." Elias stopped at the door. "It's mud up to your knees, Hattie, and moving granite boulders. It's man's work." "It's our work," Hattie corrected, grabbing a pair of heavy leather work gloves she'd found in the barn. "If we lose this land to Silas Vane, I go back to being the town joke, and you go back to being a ghost in your own cabin. I prefer this reality, hard as it is." "Besides," she added, meeting his gaze squarely, "physics doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It cares about weight and leverage, and I have plenty of weight." Elias stared at her for a long beat. A corner of his mouth twitched almost a smile. "Don't fall in the creek. I'm not fishing you out." The work was grueling beyond anything Hattie had ever experienced. The air was thin and cold, burning her lungs. The mud sucked at her heavy boots, making every step a battle. Elias worked like a machine possessed. He didn't just lift rocks. He attacked them, channeling years of rage and guilt into brute force. He rolled boulders the size of whiskey barrels, his muscles straining under his bare-hide coat. Hattie couldn't lift what he lifted. At first, she felt useless watching him sweat in the freezing air. But then they reached a granite slab lodged deep in the creek bank that even Elias couldn't budge. He strained against it, roaring with effort, his boots slipping in the mud. "Move," Hattie said, grabbing a 6-foot iron crowbar from the tools. "Hattie, you can't." "I said move, Elias." He stepped back, breathing hard. Hattie jammed the crowbar under the lip of the slab. She didn't try to lift with her arms. Instead, she leaned her entire 300 pounds onto the end of the bar. She threw her weight into it, grunting with the effort. Slowly, agonizingly, the earth groaned. The suction broke with a wet, sucking sound. The massive slab shifted, rolling out of its bed and tumbling into the position Elias needed. Hattie leaned against the bank, gasping for air, sweat stinging her eyes. Elias stared at the moved rock, then at her. There was no mockery in his eyes. There was respect. Pure, unadulterated respect. "Physics," he grunted, nodding slowly. They worked in tandem for a week. They spoke little, but they developed a rhythm. He directed the flow. She provided the unstoppable force. They came back to the cabin at night, too exhausted to do anything but eat stew and collapse into sleep. Hattie in the bed, Elias on his rug, but the distance between them felt smaller. But Vane hadn't forgotten them. On the 8th day of construction, they went further upstream to source timber for the sluice gate. Elias, walking ahead, suddenly stopped, throwing his arm out to halt Hattie. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Hattie peered around him. Lying across their water source wasn't a fallen log. It was a dead calf. Its throat had been cut cleanly. Pinned to its hide with a hunting knife was a neatly typed note. Elias ripped the note free. Hattie saw his hands tremble, not with fear this time, but with the old familiar rage. "What does it say?" she asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Elias crumpled the paper in his fist. "It says, 'The mountain takes the weak. Sell before the snow flies again.' It's vain." Hattie looked at the innocent dead animal, then at her husband. The demon was surfacing. His eyes were scanning the tree line. "He was here," Elias hissed, "on our land, while we slept." "He wants you to react, Elias," Hattie said, grabbing his arm. His forearm was rock-hard muscle. "He wants the demon to ride down to town and shoot up his office so he can have the marshal hang you. That's how he wins." Elias looked down at her hand on his arm. He seemed to struggle to recognize her through the red haze of his anger. "We don't fight him with bullets," Hattie said firmly, squeezing his arm. "We fight him by finishing the wall. We fight him by surviving. We show the inspector that this is our home." Elias took a shuddering breath. The tension didn't leave him, but the murderous impulse receded. "He'll kill us if we stay, Hattie. You should go down the mountain." "I told you the first day," Hattie said, releasing him and walking toward the dead calf to help him move it. "I have nowhere else to go. We finish the wall." 2 days before Christmas, the weather turned hard again. The sky became a bruised, leaden grey, promising heavy snow. The retaining wall was finished, a testament to their combined will. But the victory was hollow without the paperwork. "I have to go to the outpost at Dead Mule," Elias said at breakfast. He was cleaning his Winchester rifle with meticulous, obsessive care. "The inspector is due there tomorrow on the last stage before the pass closes. If I don't register the improvements in person, Vane could bribe him to say he never saw them." Hattie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin. "You can't make it back in 1 day before the snow hits." "I'll have to stay overnight at the outpost," Elias said. He didn't look at her. "You'll be alone up here for 24 hours. The silence stretched taut. They both knew what that meant. Vane was watching. Elias stood up and walked to the heavy oak chest at the foot of the bed. He pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a massive dragoon pistol, a horse soldier's weapon, heavy and lethal. He walked over and placed it on the table in front of her. "It kicks like a mule. Hold it with both hands. Don't aim. Just point it at the middle of whatever comes through that door and pull the trigger." Hattie stared at the cold metal. "You think he'll come?" "I think he's desperate," Elias said. He put on his bear hide coat. He paused at the door, looking back at her. He looked like he wanted to say something. Something real. Something about the way she filled the silence in the cabin, or how he slept better, listening to her breathe. Instead, he said, "Bar the door as soon as I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll be back before the worst of the snow." He was gone. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. Hattie spent the day in a state of high anxiety. Every snap of a twig outside sounded like a footstep. She kept the dragoon pistol tucked into her apron waistband. Its weight was comforting and terrifying. Sunset brought the wind. Darkness fell like a heavy curtain. Hattie lit both lanterns, making the cabin bright, a beacon in the blackness. She barred the door with the heavy timber beam Elias had installed. She sat in the rocking chair, facing the door, the pistol in her lap. She waited. It began at midnight. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something heavy hitting the porch, then the smell. Coal oil. Hattie stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" "Just the eviction notice, Mrs. Blackwood." Silas Vane's smooth, hateful voice came through the thick wood. "Elias is here." Hattie lied, her voice trembling. "He has a rifle aimed at the door." Vane laughed. "My scout watched your husband ride out this morning on that monster horse of his. You're all alone, fatty. And we're just going to warm things up a bit." He wasn't alone. "Come on out, Hattie May," another voice called. A familiar voice, a voice from Willow Creek. Hattie froze. Caleb Thorne. The very same, Prudence's fiancé sneered from outside. Your pa says hello. Vane here paid a handsome price for someone who knew the lay of the land up here. Told him you were probably eating the wallpaper by now. The betrayal hit her harder than the cold. Her own town, her own family's connections had led the wolves to her door. They hadn't just cast her out. They wanted her erased. Why are you doing this? She cried out. Business is business, Hattie, Vane said. Burn the woodshed first, boys. Let her see what winter is really like. Hattie heard footsteps running around the side of the cabin. A moment later, an orange glow flickered against the frosted window pane. They were burning the winter fuel. Without wood, she would freeze in 2 days. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. She was trapped. If she stayed inside, they would eventually burn the cabin down around her ears. If she went out, she was at the mercy of 3 men who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. She looked at the dragoon pistol in her shaking hands. Elias had trusted her to hold the line. Use your weight. The thought was sudden, intrusive, and brilliant. The cabin had a root cellar. A trapdoor in the floor near the kitchen led down to a cold storage dugout beneath the foundation. Elias kept a few kegs of blasting powder down there for clearing stumps. Hattie moved fast. She grabbed a lantern and threw open the trapdoor. She practically fell down the ladder into the earthy darkness. She grabbed a small keg of powder, about 5 pounds, and a coil of fuse. Upstairs, she heard the heavy thud of an axe hitting the front door. They weren't waiting for the fire. They were breaking in. Hattie scrambled back up the ladder. She placed the keg in the center of the room near the fireplace. She shoved one end of the fuse into the bung hole of the keg and trailed the other end toward the root cellar trap door. The axe struck again. Wood splintered. A crack appeared in the door. Coming in ready or not, Porky? Caleb Thorne yelled, drunk on power and probably whiskey. Hattie stood by the open trap door. She lit the end of the fuse with the lantern. It hissed angrily, talking to life. I'm warning you, Vane, Hattie screamed, her voice guttural, sounding shockingly like Elias. Break that door down, and I'll blow us all to hell. The axe stopped mid-swing. Silence outside. She's bluffing, Caleb said nervously. She's Tobias Sutcliffe's daughter. Vane murmured, sounding unsure for the first time. She doesn't know how to use powder. Try me, Hattie roared. She watched the fuse burn closer to the keg. 5 feet. 4 feet. She wasn't bluffing. She would not let them take Elias's home. She would not let them win. The door groaned. A boot kicked it, splintering the wood around the bar. Hattie looked at the fuse. 3 feet. She looked at the trap door. She had to time it perfectly. She had to drop into the cellar and pull the heavy trapdoor shut above her, just as the keg blew. It would destroy the cabin floor, blow the roof off, and hopefully take the men at the door with it. The cellar was deep earth. It might protect her from the blast wave. It was suicide, or it was salvation. The door exploded inward. 3 figures, silhouetted by the burning woodshed, rushed in. Hattie jumped into the hole. The world ended in a flash of white and a roar that sounded like the earth cracking in half. Hattie hit the dirt floor of the root cellar just as the blast wave slammed the heavy trapdoor shut above her. Dirt rained down from the ceiling beams. The shockwave punched the air out of her lungs, leaving her gasping in the sudden suffocating darkness. Above her, the sound of splintering timber and the groan of the cabin disintegrating filled the void. Then silence. A ringing, heavy silence that felt louder than the explosion. Hattie lay curled in the dirt, coughing in the acrid dust. She was alive. She wiggled her toes. She moved her fingers. Alive. Help, she croaked, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. Above her, the trapdoor was buried under debris. She pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to claw at her throat. She had saved herself from the fire and the men only to bury herself alive. She didn't know how much time passed. The air in the small cellar grew thin and stale. The cold began to seep down through the dirt. She huddled against a sack of potatoes, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to since she left Willow Creek. Please, let him come back. Don't let him find an empty grave. Elias Blackwood rode Obsidian into the clearing just as the first grey light of dawn touched the peaks. He had ridden through the night, battling drifts up to the horse's chest, driven by a gnawing dread that had settled in his gut the moment he left the outpost. He pulled the horse up, and a sound tore from his throat, a raw animal keen of despair. The cabin was gone. The front wall was blown out. The roof had collapsed inward, a jumble of smoking, blackened logs. The woodshed was a pile of embers. "Hattie!" He threw himself off the horse, stumbling in the deep snow. He ran toward the ruin, his heart shattering in his chest. He had brought her here. He had brought an innocent woman to this hell, and now she was dead. The demon temper didn't come this time. Only a crushing, suffocating grief. He reached the wreckage of the porch. He saw a boot sticking out of a snowbank near the edge of the blast zone. Elias drew his dragoon pistol, his hand steady with the calm of a man who has nothing left to lose. He walked over and kicked the snow away. It was Caleb Thorne. The man was alive, but barely. His face was burned, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He moaned, opening his eyes to see the towering figure of Elias standing over him. She's crazy," Caleb wheezed, spitting blood. She blew it. She blew it all up." "Where is she?" Elias asked, his voice dead. "Dead," Caleb groaned. "Had to be. She was inside, right on top of the keg." Elias looked at the smoking crater where his living room used to be. A darkness swept over him deeper than any rage he had ever known. He cocked the hammer of the pistol. He aimed it between Caleb's eyes. "Don't," a voice said. It was faint, muffled. It seemed to come from the ground itself. Elias froze. "Hattie! Elias!" The voice was stronger this time. "The cellar. I'm in the cellar." The pistol dropped from Elias's hand. He scrambled over the smoking debris, disregarding the burns to his hands, as he heaved charred logs and shattered planks aside. He found the outline of the trap door buried under the remains of the kitchen table. "I'm coming!" he roared. "Hold on, Hattie, I'm coming!" With a strength that defied reason, he gripped the edge of the trapdoor and ripped it open, snapping the iron hinges. Light flooded the hole. And there, looking up at him covered in soot dust and spiderwebs, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Hattie blinked in the sudden brightness. "You're late," she rasped. Elias reached down and pulled her out. He didn't just hoist her. He pulled her into him, burying his face in her dusty hair, holding her so tight her ribs creaked. He was shaking. The giant, the mountain man, the demon, he was sobbing. "I thought I lost you," he choked out. "I thought—" "God, Hattie." Hattie held him back, her own tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "I told you, Elias, I'm sturdy. It takes more than a keg of powder to remove me." A click of a revolver hammer broke the moment. Silas Vane had pulled himself from the wreckage on the other side of the cabin. He was battered, his fine suit in tatters, blood running down his forehead. But he held a Derringer pistol leveled at them. "Touching reunion," Vane spat, swaying unsteadily. "But the deadline is today, Blackwood, and dead men don't sign deeds." Elias turned. He gently set Hattie behind him. The change in him was instantaneous. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He didn't reach for his gun. He started walking toward Vane. "Stay back!" Vane shouted, his hand shaking. "I'll shoot her, I swear it." "You won't shoot anyone," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "Because you're trembling, Silas. You're cold. You're hurt. and you're looking at a man who just got his life back." Vane fired. The bullet went wide, kicking up snow. Elias didn't flinch. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. He knocked the gun from Vane's hand with a backhanded slap that sounded like a whip crack. Then he grabbed Vane by the lapels of his ruined coat and lifted him off the ground. Elias walked him backward until Vane was pinned against the only standing part of the chimney. Elias raised a fist like a sledgehammer. He was going to kill him. Hattie could see it. The rage was there, demanding blood for the threat to his family. "Elias!" Hattie yelled. Elias paused, his fist trembling in the air. "Look at me," Hattie commanded. She stepped over the rubble, limping slightly. She walked up to him and placed her hand on his heaving chest right over his heart. "He isn't worth it. You aren't a killer, Elias. You aren't the demon they say you are. Don't let him make you one." Elias looked at Vane's terrified face, then down at Hattie's hand. He took a deep breath. The tension left his shoulders. He dropped Vane into the snow. "Get out," Elias growled. "Take Thorn and get off my mountain. If I ever see your shadow on my land again, I won't need a gun. I'll let the wolves have you." Vane scrambled backward, dragging the moaning Caleb Thorn with him toward the horses that had scattered into the trees. They didn't look back. 3 months later. The spring of 1885 was the most beautiful Willow Creek had ever seen. Wildflowers carpeted the valley, and the air was sweet with pine. Up on Devil's Peak, the sound of hammers rang out. A new cabin was rising. It was bigger than the last one, with large windows to let in the light, and a reinforced roof designed by an engineer from Cheyenne. The inspector had come and gone, impressed not by the sluice which had survived the blast, but by the sheer determination of the couple holding the claim. The deed was signed. The land was theirs. Hattie sat on the new porch, a blanket over her legs, watching Elias hoist a beam into place. He was shirtless, sweating in the sun, looking every bit the mountain man. But when he saw her watching, he stopped. He climbed down the ladder and walked over to her. He knelt beside her chair. He placed a large, calloused hand on her stomach, which was just beginning to show the swell of new life. "Is he kicking?" Elias asked softly. "She," Hattie corrected, smiling. "She is sleeping, like her father should be." Elias chuckled, a sound that came easily to him now. "I have to finish the roof, Hattie. I promised you a roof that would never fall." "You promised me a home, Elias," she said, leaning forward to kiss his forehead, right over the faded scar. "And you gave me that, the day you let me eat your biscuits." The town of Willow Creek still gossiped. They still told stories about the demon of Bighorn. But the stories had changed. They whispered now that the demon had been tamed by a woman who walked into a fire and came out with his heart in her hands. They said she was big. They said she was heavy. And Elias Blackwood, the man who loved her, would tell anyone who asked, "Aye, she is. She is the anchor that keeps me from drifting away. She is the weight of my world, and I wouldn't trade an ounce of her for all the gold in the Rockies." And that is the incredible story of Hattie and Elias. From a marriage of convenience to a battle for survival, they proved that true strength isn't about muscles or anger. It's about standing your ground when the whole world wants to knock you down. Hattie wasn't just the obese girl the town mocked. She was a warrior who saved the demon from himself. What did you think of Hattie's decision to light that fuse? Was it bravery or madness? And do you think Elias would have pulled the trigger on Vane if she hadn't stopped him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dramatic Western romance, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story of love, betrayal, and redemption. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.